back in the day when I was in design school, one of the first projects that they got us to do was they got us to draw straight lines on the paper, and they got us to fill in like one of those grid sheets of paper to draw over each grid on the paper with like a pen. They got us just to draw lines on a paper. At the beginning, I kind of thought this was super insulting. It's like, really? I can draw a line on a piece of paper. But it wasn't until later on that I actually realized the importance of that. Because graphic design is all about precision and detail and noticing the smallest details in typefaces and color change. And in order to be a good designer, you have to understand those things at the absolute core and on the minutest level. And if you notice them and you care about them, that is going to set you apart later on down the road when you're creating your portfolio and your own style and your own. Also, side note, I'm sorry if I'm talking a little funny. So last night I was eating dinner with my wife and I bit my tongue. Like, I hardcore bit my tongue. Like, it looks like I had like a tongue piercing. It broke skin, it bled. It was bad. And now I'm talking a little differently, so sorry about that. Okay, sorry. So that is how I think you find your photography style. You have to go back to the fundamentals and not just understand them, you need to know them. Like, know how they work, not just understand it enough to be able to like get a picture together. You have to understand every detail of it. So what are the first things you learn in photography, right? You learn ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. And once you kind of handle those and you figure them out enough in order to take a photo, it's really easy, and this is what I did. It's really easy to be like, okay, I'm done with those, I can move on. I don't need to worry about those anymore. However, when you get to a point in your photography that you want to start creating a personal style, something that is unique to you, it's important to go back to those basic fundamentals and start analyzing them. Do I have some assumptions about these photography fundamentals that may be wrong and actually hindering my development of my own style? You've got to inspect them inside, out, backwards, forwards, in every way until you really understand them. So that's what this video is all about. I'm gonna take you through the journey that I took when I went back and looked at kind of the fundamentals and how I used that to actually build my own style. So I'm gonna show you examples specifically from my wedding photography because I think that was the side that actually changed most dramatically after I went through this journey. So there was 3 parts to this process. First, there was kind of figuring out the misconceptions that I had about these fundamental photography basics. And then there was a realization of what I needed to master and what I needed to learn in order to kind of get past those misconceptions. And then lastly, it resulted in me finding and developing my own style. So I'm gonna tell you each of those 3 things for each of the 3 photography fundamentals, and that's ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Okay, so let's start with ISO, right? What do you kind of know about it? Oh, okay, well, it's the sensitivity of light to your camera, right? Having a low ISO is good because your photo's gonna be the sharpest, it's gonna have the best coloring, it's not gonna have grain, and if you move the ISO up, it's gonna be really grainy, and that's bad, and you wanna stay away from high ISOs. Noise is terrible, and you must avoid it at all costs, right? And then I also kind of believe that in between that, it was just kind of like whatever, the Wild West. You just kind of used whatever ISO that worked, and there was no structure that I used in order to choose which ISO I wanted to use for a photo. I kind of just like guessed. So the thing about the noise is that, well, noise looks different on different cameras and noise comes in at different ISOs at different cameras depending on the level of camera. So it wasn't until I started shooting with film did I start to really think about ISO differently. When you shoot with film, you tend to start with ISO because you gotta buy a certain type of film, right? And so I used film stocks to mold my ideas about how I think about ISO. So in film, you're like, oh, I have lots of light. I'm gonna get, ISO, I'm gonna get a 400 ISO film, or I'm gonna get 160. And I'm gonna be shooting in really low light, and I kind of like grain, so I'm gonna shoot it at 3200 200 with this certain type of film and stuff like that. Choosing your film stock was such a stylistic choice and such an intentional thing when you were shooting in film. But with digital, it didn't seem to have that kind of intentional choice. I was just kind of like doing whatever and just staying away as much as possible from noise. So through this process, I found out that I actually loved grain. I loved grain so much that I actually use it as part of my style in my wedding photography. And I stopped seeing low ISO as good and high ISO as bad. I saw it as kind of a spectrum of choice. Instead of just being like, oh, I want to stay away from high ISO, it was a spectrum of like, okay, what is my intentional choice here? What is the base of my photo gonna be? What is the first choice I'm going to make in what I want my photo to look like? Do I want it down here being clean and sharp, or do I want it up here kind of like loose and grainy and a little bit filled with more character? I started being intentional about what I was choosing. Aperture. Basic thing I knew about Aperture was that, well, you want a really nice big aperture because it lets lots of light in and light's good, and along with that, it gives you that cool like background blurry thing in the background, and so that's good, right? You want to shoot at the lowest f-stop possible, right? You always want to shoot at 1.4. You always want to shoot at 1.8, 1.2. Like that is where you want to be. What actually made me start to think about this was I was teaching a basic photography class, and one of the students was like, hey, somebody recommended that I get this 50mm lens. It's like really nice and it's like 1.4, and I took it home and I started taking photos, but the photos are blurry. And isn't this supposed to be like a nice lens, but why is it so blurry? And then I asked her, what aperture are you using to shoot with? And she said, of course I'm using 1.4. Isn't that the point of buying it? And so I realized she thought this way, and often I thought the same way, that shooting at 1.4 is the best. Shooting at f11 is like old school and lame, and you don't want to do that. And so I had this misconception about what I thought aperture was, and I realized it was hindering me in really creating a specific style of things that I wanted and I really liked in my images. But then I realized like, no, okay, 1.4 isn't just always the best, and f11 is like old school lame people that want everything to be clear and in focus. It was this spectrum of choice, this spectrum of intentional decisions that I needed to make. So if I wanted something really light and airy and kind of out of focus and full of character, then I would shoot at 1.4, and it would be okay if things were kind of a little blurry and out of focus. But if I was shooting this lifestyle shoot and there was a product in the shot, the client doesn't want that image to be out of focus. They want it to be clear so they can see it and so they can sell the product. A bonus misconception, and this goes way, way back to when I first really started photography as my job. When I first started photography, I thought that like I don't know what it was, but I kind of didn't like low apertures that were like 1.4 and 1.8, because I knew other people that were like, oh, you've got to get these like prime lenses, like that's totally the way to go. And I was like, that is not the way to go. The way to go is to have zoom lenses that are 70 to 200, 2.8, and a 24 to 70 2.8. That is the thing you gotta have. Prime lenses are like lame. You gotta like switch them out and they're like dumb. And so yes, I shot weddings with a gigantic 24 to 70 and a 70 to 200 on me, and I could only ever shoot at 2.8. And that was because I didn't have a good grasp of aperture. I didn't realize the massive difference there is between f1.4, 1.8, 2.0, and 2.8. I thought 2.8 was like already awesome, and I didn't need any more. I didn't need any of that additional light, and I didn't need any of that kind of like stylistic choice of the depth of field. I didn't fully understand it, and therefore I wasn't making informed decisions. I was just making decisions on things that I kind of guessed and things that other people told me, like what their opinion was. So I kind of went from like not knowing anything about low apertures to being kind of obsessed with them and shooting everything at 1.4, and then now coming back to where I realize there's a place for all of those things, but I need to intentionally choose them. And when I do that, that's when I start developing a style that's specific to me. Shutter speed was kind of the most kind of vague concept to me, I think, for some reason. Like, you use the really fast stuff for sports, for really fast things, and then you use the really long, slow shutter speeds for like night photography and making water look like weird and silky and smooth and stuff like that. And then whatever you do in regular photography, make sure it's not blurry. Blurry is bad, really bad. Don't have blurry photos. But then again, as I started shooting in film, I realized as I created this kind of step of decision making as I was taking a photo, I would start with ISO. I would start making those stylistic choices. Like, are there specific style things that I want to do with an aperture? Is there specific style choices I want with my shutter speed? And I started to look at shutter speed differently. I started seeing it as a series of stylistic choices. But then I also started to see it as kind of like the glue that put the photo together. I started seeing it as a clock rather than a setting. I started seeing it as just the time it took in order to take the photo. And I know that's really nuanced and it might not make a difference to you. Thinking about it that way and really getting a really deep grasp on these settings was really helpful in me as I was making these stylistic choices to create a style of my own. And so for shutter speed, there was actually times that I wanted to choose to have a blurry photo. But because I had this misconception that kind of like blurry photos are bad, stay away, I never tried anything like that. And I never had the option to choose something like that. And I started to realize that I like a touch of blur in a particular wedding photo. As a couple is kind of walking down a laneway into the sunset, adding a little bit of blur to the image creates a bit of character and emotion, and it tells the story, I think, in a way that I want to tell it. Shutter speed wasn't all about just making the photo sharp for sports and long for long exposures. It was this whole spectrum of choice, nuanced choice, that I needed to really take a close look at. Okay, so are you noticing the patterns here? So I'd say the first one is take a look at your assumptions. If you're like me, I tend to just like learn as much as I need to learn just to like make me dangerous, and then I jump into it. And so often I don't fully understand a concept as much as I need to in order to make informed decisions. So really go back to ISO, shutter speed, aperture, and think like, do I really understand this? Are there some assumptions here that are actually holding me back from being able to make some stylistic choices in my photography? Another thing is master how these settings interact. So one part of my assumptions is that I just kind of like, I had really a broad idea of what these settings did. So I didn't realize that there's a difference between shutter speeds like 1/30th of a second, 60th of a second, and 80th of a second. Like if I want blurry photos, they look different at different settings. And now I know the difference between what a 60th of a second photo looks like and a 1/5 of a second photo looks like. And it wasn't until I started to really look really closely at all of these details is when I started to see like which one of those that I liked. Like I realized like, ooh, I liked 30th of a second photos, and I'm gonna use that with a really low aperture of 1.4, and I'm gonna do with a high grain I'm gonna shoot that at 3200 with this grain. So I have this like very, very interesting and very different photo. So master each step of these settings. There is a world of choice and interest with each of these, within aperture, within ISO, within shutter speed, at all of these individual settings is. And I think that is like the bedrock, that is the beginning of really creating your style, is making intentional choices. That's why I always suggest people get off auto mode, get off any of the automatic modes, use full manual all the time and make intentional choices. Because when you do that, you're gonna make choices that you like. And that's what your style is. Your style is the things that you like. It's the things how you see the world. It's how you want to use your camera, how you want to use those settings to tell your story.